There is a strange moment that many people experience in conversations, but very few stop to analyze it carefully. At the beginning of the discussion, everything feels normal. You express your thoughts clearly, you explain your perspective, and you expect the conversation to move toward understanding. But as the interaction continues, something begins to shift in a subtle way. Instead of clarity, you start feeling a strange pressure to explain yourself again and again. Your words seem to lose their strength, and slowly the focus of the conversation moves away from what you originally said. By the end of the discussion, you may even find yourself apologetic for something that you were not responsible for in the first place. When the conversation ends, you replay the entire situation in your mind, trying to understand what just happened. You entered the discussion confident about your position, yet somehow you left the conversation feeling uncertain about your own thinking. This experience is far more common than most people realize. In many cases, it happens because someone in the conversation is quietly controlling the direction of your thinking. Not through obvious force, not through open aggression, but through small psychological moves that guide how the interaction unfolds. What makes this pattern dangerous is that it rarely feels like control while it is happening. It feels like normal conversation. It feels like simple disagreement or clarification. Yet beneath that surface, certain behaviors are shaping the outcome of the discussion. Today, we are going to talk about one of the most important patterns you can recognize in human communication. If someone repeatedly does a certain thing during conversations, it can be a strong sign that they are trying to control how you think, how you respond, and sometimes even how you see yourself. Once you learn to recognize this pattern, something interesting happens. Conversations that once felt confusing suddenly become clear. The tactics that once influenced your thinking begin to lose their power. And most importantly, you gain the ability to maintain control over your own perspective instead of unconsciously adopting someone else's. So the real question is not whether manipulation exists in everyday conversations. The real question is whether you can recognize it when it happens. Human communication is not only about exchanging information. Beneath every conversation, there are psychological dynamics that influence how people interpret words, how they evaluate arguments, and how they respond emotionally. Some people communicate in a way that encourages clarity and mutual understanding. Others communicate in ways that gradually shift control toward themselves. The difference between these two styles of communication is extremely important. In healthy communication, both individuals feel heard and respected. Even when disagreements occur, the discussion remains balanced. Each person has the space to express their perspective without feeling pressured to abandon their own thoughts. But in manipulative communication, something very different happens. One person slowly begins shaping the structure of the conversation itself. They guide which topics are explored, which concerns are dismissed, and which interpretations appear reasonable. At first, this influence is almost invisible. The manipulator may ask questions that seem harmless. They may reframe the discussion in ways that appear logical. They may introduce small doubts about how events are remembered or interpreted. None of these actions look aggressive, yet each one slowly changes the direction of the conversation. Over time, this process creates a psychological imbalance. One person begins adapting their thinking to match the narrative presented by the other. They may not even realize that their perspective is shifting. They simply feel that conversations with this person often leave them uncertain about their own conclusions. This uncertainty is not accidental. It is often the result of repeated conversational pattern designed to influence perception. Once someone becomes skilled at controlling these patterns, they can guide discussions in ways that subtly strengthen their own position. Understanding these dynamics does not require suspicion toward every person you meet. Instead, it requires awareness of how communication patterns shape the outcome of interactions. When you recognize these patterns clearly, it becomes much easier to maintain independence in your thinking. Imagine a situation where you bring up a concern about something that happened earlier. Your intention is simple. You want to discuss the issue and reach a clear understanding. At the beginning of the conversation, you explain your perspective calmly. You describe what happened and why it bothered you. Instead of addressing the concern directly, the other person responds by questioning small details of the situation. They ask whether you are certain about what you remember. They suggest that maybe the event happened differently than you think. They introduce small pieces of uncertainty that gradually shift the focus away from the original concern. Now the conversation is no longer about the issue you raised. It has become a discussion about whether your interpretation of the event is accurate. You find yourself explaining the situation repeatedly, while the original concern slowly fades into the background. This shift may not appear significant at first, but it creates an important psychological change. Instead of evaluating the behavior that caused the problem, the conversation now revolves around evaluating your perception. Another common pattern occurs when someone repeatedly reframes your emotional reactions. You may explain that a certain comment or action made you uncomfortable. Rather than exploring why the situation affected you that way, the other person quickly introduces a different explanation. They may suggest that the situation was simply a misunderstanding. They may imply that your reaction was influenced by stress or mood. They may even present their interpretation as the more logical or objective view of the situation. Gradually, these reframing patterns create a new narrative where your reactions appear less reliable. When this dynamic happens frequently, people often begin doubting their own emotional responses. They start assuming that their interpretation must be incorrect, even when their instincts initially felt clear. Another example appears when conversations constantly move away from the original topic. You try to address a specific issue, but the discussion shifts towards something unrelated. Instead of resolving the concern you raised, you find yourself responding to new topics that appear unexpectedly during the conversation. This pattern can leave people feeling mentally exhausted because the discussion never reaches a clear conclusion. The conversation simply moves in circles until the original concern disappears. People who attempt to control conversations often rely on several subtle tactics that influence how others process information. One of the most effective tactics is the introduction of controlled doubt. By questioning specific details of a situation, the manipulator creates uncertainty about the accuracy of the other person's interpretation. When doubt appears repeatedly, the person experiencing it may begin questioning their memory and judgment. Instead of focusing on the core issue, they become focused on proving that their understanding of the situation is correct. Another tactic involves shifting the emotional tone of the interaction. At certain moments, the manipulator may appear supportive and understanding. At other moments, they may become dismissive or critical. This unpredictable pattern creates psychological instability within the conversation. Humans naturally prefer stable communication patterns. When approval and criticism alternate unpredictably, people often adjust their behavior in an attempt to maintain harmony. Over time, this adjustment can give the manipulator greater influence over how the conversation unfolds. Narrative control is another powerful tactic. By consistently presenting interpretations that position themselves as reasonable and others as mistaken, manipulators gradually establish a dominant perspective. When this narrative repeats frequently, it begins shaping how events are remembered and discussed in the future. These tactics do not rely on open conflict. In many cases, they operate quietly within ordinary discussions. Because they appear subtle and logical, they can influence conversations without attracting attention. Recognizing these communication patterns is the moment when manipulation begins losing its effectiveness. Awareness allows you to observe interactions more objectively, instead of automatically adapting to the narrative presented by someone else. When you notice that conversations consistently introduce doubt about your perception, it becomes important to pause and evaluate the situation more carefully. Instead of immediately accepting the interpretation offered by the other person, you can take time to examine whether the discussion is being redirected away from the original concern. Another helpful approach is paying attention to how you feel after conversations. Healthy communication usually produces clarity, even when disagreements occur. Manipulative communication often leaves people feeling confused or mentally unsettled. By recognizing these emotional signals, you can identify patterns that deserve closer examination. When the same communication dynamic appears repeatedly, it becomes easier to understand how influence may be shaping the conversation. Understanding manipulation is not about becoming suspicious of everyone around you. Instead, it is about recognizing the psychological patterns that sometimes appear in human interactions. When you understand these patterns clearly, you gain the ability to protect your own thinking. Pay attention to conversations that consistently introduce doubt about your perception. Notice when discussions repeatedly shift away from the original issue. Observe whether someone frequently reframes your reactions in ways that weaken your confidence. Healthy relationships allow both people to express perspectives without constant psychological pressure. They support clarity rather than confusion. Developing awareness of these communication dynamics is one of the most valuable psychological skills a person can have. Once you recognize the patterns, you become far less vulnerable to subtle influence. If you found this discussion helpful, consider subscribing to the channel for more insights about understanding human behavior and protecting your mental independence. And if you believe this information could help someone else recognize similar patterns in their own life, sharing this video may help them see these dynamics more clearly. Thank you for listening.